Good evening, family of Northgate. Thanks for joining with us tonight as we continue in the book of Acts. Hope everyone had a great Independence Day yesterday and had time with your family and friends, and those are always good times. But here we are back at it this morning, or this afternoon, this evening, to continue in the book of Acts. Last week we finished up with Paul is telling King Agrippa and Festus once again. He was giving him his testimony, how he came to know Christ. He was also saying the only reason he was there in prison and jailed by these men was that some people from Jerusalem thought he was a threat to them. He said, I've never done anything to come against the law of Moses or the Jewish religion. I've never done that, but yet you've arrested me, and but he said God has protected me up to this point, and his job was to announce to the Gentiles that God can save them through His Son Jesus Christ. So we want to start with verse 24 of chapter 26. And I'm going to read the first verse, then we'll make some comments here. It says, so Paul's giving his story and to the king and to Festus. And then it says that suddenly, verse 24, Festus shouted, Paul, you are insane. Too much study has made you crazy. So number one, I just simply says, Paul, are you mad? Because some of the versions use the term mad. Now, mad just means insane. Mad doesn't mean I'm mad at you. It just means that you've gone crazy. So I don't know if Festus, after he said this, or the reason why he said it, I don't know if Festus had seen Paul studying in his room or in his prison or what. But now I know that Festus knew that Paul was a clever guy. He was a smart man. But he also started to wonder if Paul had actually gone crazy. Now, back in chapter 25, verse 19 of Acts, we see that Festus called Jesus a dead man. But Paul was saying that Jesus was alive. So they differed there quite a bit. And he also was saying that Jesus brought light to people. This is what Paul said. He said, you call him a dead man. Paul says, I say he's alive, and yet I know this because he brings light to people. Now, I don't know if Paul was talking about the light that shone from heaven. He could have been saying that, the light that shone from heaven, or the light that was now in his heart and in his life. But anyway, Jesus brings light. And so Paul replies that he was not insane. He said, no, I'm not crazy. He said the events of Jesus' life, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, Paul says, it happened in front of a lot of people. It happened in public view. Many people had seen these events. So the reason you even have me here on trial or in prison is because you do not believe that Jesus rose again from the dead. That's the whole issue. Paul then asked King Agrippa if he believed in the prophet's message about the Messiah. Remember last week we talked about the fact that as he was going to talk with King Agrippa, he knew King Agrippa had sort of an understanding of the Jewish laws and the Jewish ways. And so in saying that, he knew that he had read some of the statements of the prophet concerning the Messiah, that there was a Messiah coming. And so he asked Agrippa if he believed the message of the prophets. Now, believing the message of the prophets just means, do you agree that the prophet said that there's a Messiah coming? Paul here was being pretty bold with that statement. And I'm sure everyone was just a bit surprised that he would even ask the king that type of question. King, do you believe in the prophet's message? Let's go to verse 28 here. Verses 28 and 29. Well, I missed 25. So it says, I'll just go ahead and read it. So Paul replied, I'm not insane, most excellent Festus. I am saying this is a sober truth. And King Agrippa knows about these things. I speak boldly, for I am sure these events are very familiar to him, and they were not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. So, verse 28 and 29. Agrippa interrupted him. Do you think you can persuade me to become a Christian so quickly? Paul replied, whether quickly or not, I pray to God that both you and everyone else here in this audience might become the same as I am, except for these chains. So, what he's saying here is the king. First of all, the king didn't answer Paul's question. Instead, he asked another question. He asked Paul, "Do you think you can persuade me to become a Christian so quickly just by saying this?" I've always thought when I heard King Agrippa say that, I always thought that he was fighting within himself, knowing that what Paul was saying was true. And so he had to take a stance against Paul. Do you think you can make me become a Christian so quickly? I firmly believe that there was something deep down in his spirit that was saying, you know, this man Paul, he's right. He's right. Jesus came as the Messiah, and he can change your life. And I think King Agrippa was really struggling with that. Now, we don't know whether the king was angry or whether or not he was sincere. I just told you, I think he was sincere enough to believe that what Paul was saying was true. Or he could have been just trying to insult Paul. I'm not sure. But I really think that there was conviction taking place in his heart and in his life. Paul's answer, we do know, was sincere. Yes, he was a prisoner of these leaders here, but he didn't hate these leaders. He cared about their eternal soul and where they were going when they died. And you know, there are people in life that come against us, and they say things. They may be mean things. They may be things that they say because they're insecure themselves and they don't like our Christian life or the way we live our lives. And so maybe they're trying to make fun of us. Maybe they're trying to insult us. But deep down in our hearts, we don't really hate them. We really don't. Or we shouldn't. Let me put it that way. What we should do is feel sorry for them in the sense that we want them to find Christ as their Lord and Savior, the Messiah who came to take away the sins of the world. So what Paul wanted for them was to have an everlasting life. Because this thing called the everlasting life was a free gift. And it's better than any other gift, having a relationship with Jesus. The people receive this gift by way of Jesus Christ. And Paul wanted everyone to have the same faith in Jesus that he did. He said, I want you to believe in Jesus. I want you to believe just the way I am right now, except for these chains, he said, that you've put me in. I don't know, perhaps the king realized that what Paul said was true, and I kind of feel that way. The king stood up at that point. Let's go to verse 30 and 32. Then the king, the governor, and Bernice, the sister of the governor, and all the others, they stood up and they left. And as they went out, they talked it over amongst themselves, and they agreed, this man hasn't done anything to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, he could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. And so that's going to be further down in our story here. So the king stands up and he leaves. and the discussion they were having, Paul's testimony, it was over. Perhaps, like I say, perhaps the king realized that what Paul was saying was true. I don't know. Maybe he knew that he too should accept Jesus as his Savior. But I kind of think the king was a little bit too proud. After Agrippa and all the guests, after they got up and left, they talked among themselves, and they all agreed that this man has not done anything worthy of guilt or worthy of death or imprisonment. But he does appeal, Paul does appeal to the Emperor Caesar. So Paul now must go to Rome. So they didn't find him guilty, but they said, okay, we will send you to Rome. Secondly, if you're taking notes, Paul begins his journey to Rome. And we're going to start with verse 1 and 2 of chapter 27 here. When the time came, we all set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left a ship whose home port was in Adramyttium, on the southwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. So Luke is writing this, and this is one of the last times we're going to hear Luke talk about himself. In other words, when he says we left port for Rome. Luke was traveling with Paul from Jerusalem to Rome, and Luke is going to be giving us many details about the voyage that they were about to take. He gives really accurate accounts of the ancient ship that sailed. Now, there were prisoners on the ship, and they were all in the custody of this Roman officer named Julius. Luke also mentions in the scriptures we just read, he mentions a guy by the name of Aristarchus. Probably Aristarchus and Luke agreed to be Paul's slaves on this ship. Now, understand, Paul was a prisoner, but he could also have slaves. So they went as his servants. They were very, very loyal to Paul. And that was probably the only way that they could actually go with Paul. So because they were so loyal, they allowed them to be on the ship with them. Verse 3, it says that the next day they docked in Sidon. So the next day when we docked in Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul, and he let him go ashore to visit with his friends, so that they could provide for his needs. So Julius allowed Paul, as they docked in Sidon, to go into the town. Paul obviously had many friends there in Sidon, and Julius, the captain of this regiment, he obviously gave Paul a lot of favor. Now, they probably gave Paul food for his journey and for other things to take on the voyage. And Captain Julius seemed to be a real kind man. And during the voyage, he showed a lot of kindness to Paul. Verses 4 and 5, let's go there. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus between the island and the mainland, keeping to an open sea. We passed along the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, landing in Myra, in the province of Lycia. So, at this time of the year, there were really strong southwest winds. So they had to sail past the northern side of Cyprus, which cost them a great deal of time. Finally, they came to the port of Myra. That's where they were headed anyway. This journey from Caesarea to Myra had taken them 2 weeks, and they were bucking a lot of headwinds. And so in verse 6 here it says, let's go there. There the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy or Rome, and he put us aboard that ship. So at Myra, they took another ship. It was a ship filled with grain, and it was headed for Rome. Thirdly, number 3, the ship reaches a place called Fair Haven. Fair Haven. Verses 7 and 9. We had several days of slow sailing, and after a great deal of difficulty, we finally neared Sindius, but the wind was against us, and we sailed across to Crete along sheltered along the sheltered coast of the island. Past the Cape of Salmon, we struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fairhaven, near the town of Lasea. We had lost a lot of time, and the weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officer about this. So the ship couldn't sail directly to Rome because of the strong winds. Their destination was Rome. They are on a new ship that was headed for Rome. This new ship also had a lot of grain on that. The owner of the ship was going to be selling his grain to the Romans. They reached Fair Harbor, and they stayed there, and they waited for the wind to change. But it was now late in the year, and the people did not sail in the winter because it was just too dangerous to make that kind of a trip. And so verses 10 to 12. Men, this is what Paul said. Men, he said, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner of the ship than he did to Paul. And since Fair Haven was an exposed harbor and a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go to Phoenix, which was another port, and farther up the coast of Crete, and then spend the winter there in Phoenix. Phoenix was a good harbor with only southwest and northwest exposure. So the men on the ship, they had to make a quick decision, and they had to decide whether to sail or not to sail. Paul was saying, let's not sail. Fair Haven was a bad place to stay during the winter. Winds would blow into the harbor, which made it dangerous for them to even stay there. But it was not as dangerous as Paul was telling them. If it would be more dangerous for them to set out to sea again. Paul had traveled by sea quite extensively, and he had a lot of experience traveling by boat. He advised the men to stay at Fair Haven, and that it was too dangerous for them to set sail. But Captain Julius did not follow Paul's advice, and he agreed with the ship's captain and the owner to sail on. Now, I think the owner wanted to get there because he wanted to, make his money and deliver his grain on time. But fourthly, number 4, we see that there was a storm that took place at sea. Paul had already warned them, let's not go out to sea. Now, I don't know that this was a thus says the Lord kind of thing. It doesn't say that here. It doesn't even say that God was involved in his decision. I think Paul was just sort of making an observation due to his experience of sailing many of those ports in the past. But they decided against it, and so they're going to head out to sea. Verses 13 to 20. So they get out to sea. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought that they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and they sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, called a northeasterner, burst across the island and blew us out into the sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship around into the wind, and so they gave up and they let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of the small island named Cauda, I think it is, where there was great difficulty. We hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us, and the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across to the sandbars on the African coast, so they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, a gale force wind continued, to batter the ship. The crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and they threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until, at last, all hope was gone. Now, so the men, they started to sail. At first, the wind was really gentle, and they were on their way to the port of Phoenix. The port of Phoenix was only about 40 miles away. It shouldn't have taken them too long to get there. But suddenly a strong storm surprised them, and once again they were in great danger. They had to drag the lifeboat onto the ship. They were dragging it behind the ship, but they didn't want that lifeboat to fall apart. So they, in their effort to have some security, they brought the lifeboat onto the ship itself. They were so afraid that the ship may break up, so then they began to take ropes and they began to tie the hull of the ship just to keep the boats together. And the wind was now beginning to take them towards the southwest, and at the southwest, many ships would hit the sandbars, hit the sandbanks, and they would be destroyed by those sand. So they didn't even know where they were going. The winds were so bad; it was turning that ship every which way but loose. So they wanted to make the ship even less heavy. So they began to take the grain that this owner of the ship, they had to try to survive any way they could. So they started taking the grain and they started unloading the grain to lighten the load on the ship. They even became more desperate, so they began to throw some of the ship's equipment off into the sea. They were in trouble. Now, sailors usually guided their ship by the position of the sun and the stars. But these sailors hadn't seen the sun or the stars for many days and many nights. They were lost. They were lost. And remember, Paul told them this is not a good idea, but he was the only one that felt that way. These people, these sailors, they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know whether or not they were near dangerous sandbars that would destroy the ship. And it says there in verse 20, in verse 20, until at last all hope was gone. Basically, what they're saying is they gave up. They gave up. They had no hope of anybody even coming out to help them in any way. I don't know if you've ever been in a storm similar to that. We've all been in storms before, I'm sure. But I also know that being out there on the water can be a little dangerous, be a lot dangerous actually. And if you've ever been on a ship that encountered those types of conditions, and they were very primitive in their sailing. I mean, they did well, but it's not like It's not like ships encountering those kind of storms today. But they felt like they were hopeless. And I got to thinking about that. So many people, they make wrong decisions not to follow the ways of the Lord. And they get out there and a storm hits and they're not sure. They're not sure where they're at. They're not sure of their location. People are afraid of what's going to happen to their lives, and they become real discouraged and distraught. And now they feel like they are helpless and hopeless. And so we're going to stop there. We're going to pick it up next week. This is kind of an exciting story. We'll start off with verse 21. You can go ahead and read it, but we'll make some comments next week regarding this voyage that they were on. We know they make it, but we're going to see how they make it. Well, I hope you have a great night. And don't forget, Sunday we're going to be celebrating the 10th anniversary in our building there on the corner of Washburn and Donna. How God has been good. He has been faithful to us. And so we're going to be celebrating the goodness of God on Sunday. I don't think let me just tell you, you're not going to want to miss this service. I'm not preaching. I have a lot of other people doing some speaking and talking. We got some videos to show you, videos of the past 10 years. I think you're really, really going to enjoy Sunday. And then we're going to have lunch afterwards together and all eat together and just celebrate God's goodness to us at Northgate. Well, God bless you. I pray that you have a great night. And see you Sunday. Bye.